Hello and welcome to Roll for Topic, a roundtable discussion about topics related to running role-playing games. I'm Chris Salzman.
And I'm Andy Rao.
Andy, it's episode 50.
My goodness.
Yeah. It's a lot of content, I guess, to put out in a podcast form. But yeah, it's pretty exciting. I'm proud of us for sticking with it this long.
I don't know what I thought would happen when we started out low all of this time ago, but it sure has been way more fun and exciting to do than I realized.
Yeah, it's been super good. Yeah, I don't think this is not like we're quitting. We did 50, now we're done. That sort of episode. I think if anything, I think I'm more interested in doing another 50 at this point. Like if you had told me up front, hey, you're going to do 50 episodes, maybe let's just not then.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that seems like a lot of work. But you spread it out over, every other week, and it's not too bad.
Do you remember how amazing it was when we just got like one episode done and then maybe a second one? I mean,
yes.
A sense of accomplishment. And here we are. Look at us. We're seasoned pros.
I don't know if we've ever said it on air, but so there is a lost episode. We probably actually, if I'm saying that, we've probably mentioned it every other episode. But there's the first episode we recorded, we recorded it, we edited it. I think we might have listened to it once, and then we just put it in the trash can and just never listened to it ever again. Yeah, I don't think I could recover the audio if I wanted to at this point.
I think we need to start a little bit of an urban legend here, Chris. Yeah. That episode had the greatest GMing secrets and tips that you'll ever hear.
The lost episode. I'm pretty sure that episode had the most amount of ums and ahs and false starts and meandering.
Oh yes, listener, if you think it's bad now, man, go listen to our first couple of episodes.
Yeah. Well, now that we're full-on professionals, then I guess let's dive into the episode proper. So we have something somewhat fun, I guess, for the end of it. But Andy, you had mentioned that you have a bit of a chatty question up front that you wanted to ask.
Yes. Actually, I have two quick things.
Okay.
One is we got a little bit of reader feedback on a recent episode.
Okay.
So, Chris, a reader whose name, I will just call him Joel, wrote in with 2 additions to the random table of stuff that could happen in a creepy warehouse. I think we did that 2 episodes ago. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
So he has 2 things to add to the table, and I thought they were really good, so I'd like to read them here on the air, as they say. The first thing he suggested we could toss onto that table, this would, I guess, make it a D8 table of creepy warehouse stuff, is an exposed elevator. I think that's creepy enough just right there, but he says, currently at the 2nd or 3rd floor of a dim catwalk. It all of a sudden lurches to life and begins slowly descending to whatever floor you're on.
Oh boy, okay. I don't want that to happen.
You remember that I rewatched the movie Aliens recently, and there's that scene at the end where the alien queen gets in the elevator and is coming up, and they're trapped on this catwalk, and the elevator's coming up, and it's a wonderfully tense moment. So that was immediately popped in mind here. Maybe you don't have to go quite so epic with your elevator, but
yeah.
All right, and here is another one, and then the second one he sent to us is: in the corner of the cavernous warehouse, there's a small office with walls and a roof and light spilling out, although it's apparently empty. A phone begins to ring, but not like a normal ring. The rings are short, and in quick succession, they also seem to be speeding up. You realize that the ringing is timed to your heartbeat.
Oh, jeez.
Yes.
Do you answer it? I don't know if I don't know if any players would actually go and answer that. That's
where you hit escape and just quit the game, right?
Go right.
Out the windows. Anyway, thank you, Joel, for sending us your ideas, and it was super fun to hear that you enjoyed the table and enough that you had a few things to add to it. So I've told Joel, Joel's someone I know in real life, and I've told him he needs to GM a game so that we can have an excuse to bring him on the show. But
he's never GM, but he came up with this.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, well, he's a natural. There, I'm telling him he'd be a great GM. So
yeah, for real. Yeah, if you can come up with those 2 things, you have most of the session.
That's right. So I had one other thing I wanted to talk about, Chris. But first, I want to ask you. Now, in our last episode, you had just run a Halloween game. It was your kind of gimmicky game that was sort of like a 90s sitcom sort of game where they were in a spooky corn maze and a couple of other spooky environments. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you have since run that for a second group of people that was all RPG newbies. Is that right?
Yeah, for the most part, all RPG newbies, and it was people that I had met before, but I wouldn't say like we hung out and were, friendly, like friends. It was all my wife's friends, so she wanted to play it with some of her friends, so we got everybody together to go through it. But yeah, so I think out of everybody, like one person had played D&D a handful of times. Like she's been like wanting to get into it, but her groups keep falling apart for whatever reason.
Huh, yeah.
Yeah, so it was an experience. Yeah, so I like running the same scenario more than once because it gives you just a different flavor and you kind of see the different decision points and stuff that people do. They ended up doing things just kind of wildly different from the first group that I ran it for. So that first group was all like gamers, I would say. Half of them have like run games, run games pretty often. The other half have been, playing games for a while. So like when you have a group of like people that know how to play these games, right? They kind of like fit in to what you're trying to do, and they understand like the story beats that they're supposed to grab onto, and go with it. So this other group with a bunch of newbies, like they didn't have any of that. So it was just sort of a free for all. I had one player sort of just immediately wander off and go do something else entirely. I'm like, I was doing that GM thing where you're like, are you sure you want to do that? Like your entire party is back there doing this other thing. Yeah, no, I'm good over here. So all of a sudden now there's this A plot and this B plot, which was really fun to kind of sort out, and tell a story and, figure out how that was all going to fit together. But, on the fly, you're like, as a GM, you're sitting there just like, oh goodness, like I need to get them back to what everything else is going on. But I mean, you realize that everybody's having fun anyway. So it's like, well, do I need to? I mean, I guess if that's what they want to do with their character, that's totally okay. Yeah. So that like, it was really fun. There was some interesting parallels in like the kinds of characters they picked too, from group to group. I think there's just like certain 90s sitcom tropes that people have really grabbed onto. Like both groups had like a crotchety old grandpa character.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, stuff like that. Both groups decided not really like to have a parental figure that had like died or mysteriously vanished, that sort of thing. So other people were sort of stepping in to be the parents. Yeah, both groups had like younger kids as well. But yeah, so it was fun. I really like this setting. I think I'm going to write it up a little bit more formally just in case someone else wants to run it. I don't think the scenario that I had was like particularly amazing outside of Halloween. But I think there's a lot you could do with that setup of 90s sitcom, here's some character creation, that sort of stuff.
Now, one of the things that you put a lot of thought into is like the system you were going to use for it, and you ended up choosing kind of a variant on the lasers and feelings rules, which are really simple, and you described them in an episode or two ago. I'm curious, did you see a difference in the way that people like engaged with or understood or worked with the rules between your group that was mostly RPG veterans and your group that was mostly RPG newbies?
It's an interesting system. So what I'm realizing, actually having run it twice, is that the rules are super simple, right? Like you roll a die, you have, you roll some dice, you have a number that you're trying to go above or below. For whatever reason, it's almost impossible to just remember when you're trying to roll above or below that number. Like there's just something about that concept. It's really elegant in game terms, but it doesn't translate well to people sort of playing the game. And I've noticed this too. I've listened to at least one actual play of someone using lasers and feelings as a system, and like players are just constantly like, wait, which one am I trying? Do I want to get lower? Do I want to get higher? All the time with it. Yeah, it's so having gone through that, I think the next time that I do this, I might just have them pick two numbers rather than one number, right? And then you just sort of like lay it out like you're always trying to roll above.
I can see that being a little bit weird, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, again, it's one of those things where it's like, it's great. It's really cool if you're a game nerd and you like seeing the one-page RPG and see it's like a very elegant thing. But otherwise, right, like I think everybody sort of understood that it was more a storytelling game rather than a combat style game. So it worked out pretty well. I think with this second group that I ran it with, by the end we had just sort of stopped rolling for certain things because it was just like, well, I don't know. Yeah, they just wanted to kind of tell the story at that point.
From that experience, I'm curious, and I'm going to put you on the spot here. What is one thing you would take from the newbie group that you wish you could go to your veteran players and say, please be more like this? And then is there something else, like something, if you could take like one rule or one guideline from like your experienced group to tell to the newbies? I don't know. Do you understand what I'm saying? What's like one piece of like the thing that you could take away from each of those groups that you think would make for better games?
That is a really interesting question.
And I realize I'm kind of putting you on the spot. Like,
no, that's fine.
Like,
yeah.
While you think, I'll like chime in. I mean, whenever I run for newbies, I often find that they don't approach the game with like kind of concerns of like long character survival, and they're not anticipating ways the GM will like punish them or take advantage of their mistakes or actions or something like that. So they're just a little bit more inclined to do something because it seems like it would be really fun. And I often wish I could take a little bit of that energy, and inject it into myself and some other veteran players that I play with.
Going along with that, I would say my experience playing with newbies, right? Especially with this group, is they didn't really like know like what they weren't supposed to do. It's like the one player who went off and sort of created her own little story. Like, I'm going to look back on that as a fond sort of memory of running that game for a long time, for lots of reasons. But I think veteran players, like, because they know sort of games, they're more apt to sort of just go along with it. I also think that like people who play a lot of games, like they play them probably for different reasons than people who play for the first time, if that makes any sense too. But yeah, there's like something about that very chaotic energy of like, oh, I'm just gonna go do this other thing, and it's like, well, I guess there's no reason you can't, like, so let's just see what happens. So it's good, I think, for GMs to occasionally play with new people all the time, just to get that little bit of energy of like, oh, okay, different players will approach this in a different way, especially if they have different experience levels. For the newbies, I think like the one thing that I think like people who play a lot of games understand a little bit more instinctively is sort of the power level that you're operating at in a game. So like with this 90s sitcom, it's very grounded in reality, right? So there was a couple times where like a character wanted to do something, the characters wanted to do stuff. It's like, well, that doesn't totally make, like, we're not in a magical world. Like there still are some like physics and stuff at play. Like we could break the rules, but then it's just like, well, then I don't know. Like, kind of determining that power level, I think, is an important part of playing an RPG. Like if you're playing D&D, you need to understand sort of the limits of your characters, because that's all going to set the stage for lots of other decisions. Yeah, so I think it's like, it's very interesting. It's like, for the newbies, I want to be like, you need to understand sort of like what the setting is, but then for the veteran players, it's like you need to understand how to break the setting.
That's like a really clever way of putting it. Some good thoughts. So hey, I want to get to our big project today of reworking our table. But before I do have one final thing, and it is another thing where I'm going to put you on the spot.
Okay,
sort of.
Great.
So
I love it.
I have been playing Final Fantasy VII, the remake of it on the PlayStation. Okay. Yes. Yeah. And having a great time. Yeah. And I know you're a Final Fantasy fan, and I think you're like a specific fan of Final Fantasy VII. Is that correct?
Oh yes, yeah, that is my game. Like all games that people say are the best game ever, it's the game that I played when I was at a specific age.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And it's exactly, I'm enjoying it. It's exactly the type of ridiculous I could use right now. So, yes. But bringing it back to the topic of this podcast, something we often talk about, like how there's something kind of special about that Final Fantasy vibe that it has that isn't necessarily present in tabletop role playing. And so I thought it might be fun just to take a couple minutes. We don't have to spend too much time on this. And I would like to ask you, if you were sitting down with a bunch of friends and you're all kind of Final Fantasy fans, and you were just going to play straight up D&D, but you wanted to inject a little bit of that Final Fantasy vibe into it. And I'm not talking like have it be set in a crazy Final Fantasy setting. I mean, you're playing pretty regular D&D, but you just want it to lean in the direction of like a Final Fantasy feel. What are like 2 or 3 like really specific but fairly small things you might do just to apply a little coat of Final Fantasy to your D&D game, right? Yeah. I have 1 or 2 ideas like in the back of my mind. So I want to give you a minute to think about it. So let me start out by providing an answer of my own that I've thought of while I was talking about this here. And that is, I think one thing you could do in a typical D&D game is just require everybody to really describe their character's idiosyncratic appearance and clothing and equipment.
Yes.
I find that even when you have players with perfectly great D&D characters, everyone describes them just in this vocabulary of default D&D, like what type of armor is he wearing, what kind of weapon is he holding, what color cloak are they wearing. And in Final Fantasy, so much of the character of these games comes from this completely ludicrous character concepts, right?
Yes.
So in the beginning of Final Fantasy VII, this group of this like D&D style adventuring party is running around, and one person has like spiky hair and MC Hammer pants and a sword that is like larger than him that you could never use this in a real fight. He's standing next to a giant person who is literally like 4 times bigger than anyone else in the party and has a chain gun for an arm. And then I could describe the other characters, but like that right there, that right there is like so much of the game's quirky flavor is present right from the very first glimpse you get of these weird characters, right? So if everybody in a D&D game could just if they described their characters a little bit more like that, they thought like, what makes your character incredibly memorable? Like, why would someone do a double take if they saw you walk into town and they'll never forget, what you look like?
Oh yeah. So I would just say, like D&D, but make it fashion. It's like,
yes,
like, because I mean, there's like, many jokes have been told about like how many belts characters in Final Fantasy wear. There are like entire outfits in some of those games that are just belts, like going this way and that. Yeah, I think like that's a very, very good point. About it is like, and two, going back a little bit to the like the power level concept. The guy with the gun for a hand, like he's shooting bullets at enemies and stuff, but he does the exact same damage as the guy with the sword, or the woman who punches real hard.
Right, right.
Yeah, it's like nothing makes sense other than the fact that it's like you're seeing the damage output on screen. Yeah, so I think that's actually the thing that I would say, if you want to make it feel a little bit more like a JRPG, like what you need to do is just multiply all of your numbers by 10 to 100.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, just like, I mean, you're not doing 9 damage at level 1, you're doing 90 damage at level 1, that sort of thing. It's just that over the top, like, exponential growth of numbers is just such fantastic fun. Whereas like in D&D, right, you could be a level 20 whatever and only have 100 hit points or 200 hit points, something like that. Whereas if you're a level 99 in a JRPG, you could have 9,999 hit points. Yes. And that is unabashedly rad. So like, why would
I wonder if there would be a way to scale those numbers up as you gain in level? Because one thing I've noticed while playing this game, I started out hitting things, me with my giant sword, and then you have a companion who has you say, her weapons are like leather gloves. Like, so one of you has like anyway. When you start out, you're doing like 9 points of damage per hit or 12 points of damage.
Yeah.
I'm now like 2 hours into the game and I'm doing like 800 points of damage per hit. And I assume like in 2 hours, I'll be doing like 14,000 damage per hit. So I wonder like maybe good. Like every 2 levels, you like multiply every number by 10.
Yeah, it's not bad. I mean, because it's also just sort of ridiculous. It's like, because the enemies are also, ticking up at the same rate and stuff too. So it's like, I don't know. Like, I love that part of it. I think the other thing that I would say that Final Fantasy VII does in particular, you haven't really played, you've played like some of the later ones. Like, you didn't play the earlier ones.
I've played 1 and 15.
Yeah,
and I've bracketed the Final Fantasy experience. So yeah.
So 7 in particular, like the original, is just the wackiest game. Like every hour, you're hitting some sort of strange side quest mini game in it, and like oftentimes it's like they sort of weave it into the plot, but it's like it doesn't really make sense why you're snowboarding right now, but it's really fun that you're snowboarding right now. So I think like that's the other thing that I'd probably draw into D&D. And something I've tried to do a little bit, not with great success, is like you just sequence break out of D&D and then do something else, but you're still with those characters. Some sort of other game, mini game, board game, whatever, but you're playing it in character, and it's advancing the plot in some fashion. So it's going to take a little bit of work to do. But like I love that about that game is that you're never only playing like the combat mechanics of it. Like you're often doing all sorts of other stuff.
And yeah, it's not just a matter of like doing a different activity. Like you're embracing a new paradigm, like a new control scheme, a new, you have spent hours like using this combat battle menu, and now you're like trying to, wiggle your controller at the right time so that you can throw a cabbage at a, I don't know.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I think it's like, I mean, there's a lot that you could do sort of with that. I think we talked with maybe Christopher Becker when he was on. I think he does a little bit of that in his games too. Maybe I'm misremembering who it was, but like, there's something there with that I'd like to explore. Because I think like with board games, I find oftentimes now when I go back to play them, like I always want there to be a little bit more of a story to them. So it's almost like, I mean, could you play your D&D character playing a board game? Like that would be really fun. Like how would they make decisions differently from say like Andy? Like how would your barbarian make a decision about Settlers of Catan that you as a thinking person might not?
Yeah. This we can wrap up this little subtopic and move on to main thing, but I want to say one thing I am personally intrigued by and always love it when I come across this is rules in an RPG, like a tabletop RPG, for playing a game in the in character. So like a couple weeks ago I was reading a Wild West RPG, and it has a whole section on like how to resolve like various types of gambling, like poker and other types of Wild West gambling. And there's always that like part of you just wants to stop and break out like a deck of cards and just play the game, right? But I mean, there's obvious reasons why that's probably not the best way to resolve it every time. But it is kind of funny, like why am I just making a regular skill roll to like when we could break out a deck of cards here and I know the answer. I know the answer to that question, but Okay, well, we've gone on about a good variety of topics already in the last 20 minutes, so let us turn to the meat of episode 50 and take a look at our table of topics. And it's been so long since we've really done a lot with the table of topics. Why don't we take a second to just talk about what our idea was behind this table and why are we throwing this away and building a new one?
Yeah, so for probably a couple months now, we've been talking about like the concept of a season, right? In the podcast, like calling this the end of season 1 and starting season 2. And with that would come a turnover of the table of topics. So the table of topics is a way for us when we have a guest on or when it's just us to roll on this table to have something to talk about. As you can tell, because we're 20 minutes in or so of this episode, and we've been able to generate tons of stuff to talk about. Like you and I don't exactly need it, but it's nice when we have a guest on to say, okay, let's roll on this, and this will give us something to sort of talk about. And then we also would at the end of the episodes have people replace those topics as well. So like if they rolled something, then they get to replace it. Just because of how things have kind of shaken out, we now have a table of topics that only has one of those sort of guest added topics on it, and then it's a bunch of stuff that we've sort of had to fill in. So it seems like a good time to say, okay, this is the 50th episode, let's wipe that table clean, and then kind of start afresh, get some new topics on there, maybe we can pull in some of the old ones that we really liked, and then into the future, then whenever we have guests on, we can roll on this and they can have something interesting to talk about.
And to help the two of us as we come up with ideas, maybe we can articulate here. So what, Chris, have you found makes for the best kind of questions? And then let's talk also about what kind of questions don't really work out as well in the context of this show. I'm going to guess you're going to say something like this, but it is my experience that for the best questions tend to be highly practical, highly specific questions.
Yes. I would agree. Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think we've talked about it before. We had a really great conversation about using doors in dungeons once. Like, what is a door in a dungeon? Yeah, I think like because GMs tend to overthink everything, so like the more specific you can get, the more the wheels start turning. Whereas some of the other like weaker questions were just a little bit too broad. Yeah, so I think like when we're thinking about coming up with some of these topics, we'll want to stick to something more specific with them, but also not specific to a game itself. Like, right, like, so we're not going to talk about like hit points in D&D. It might be, hit points, the concept of hit points. Yeah, like how do you handle this specific kind of rule in GURPS, right? Well, read the entire book that's written about the rule in GURPS is the answer there. Yeah.
And this is going to be a D10 table, so we need 10 topics. Yeah. And we have one that we're throwing all the topics on the current D10 table topics out except for one, right?
Yes.
And Chris, I can see that you appear to have some paper or something. Can you jot these down? Okay.
Yeah.
So what is the one that we're keeping?
So we're going to keep Don Stroud came on episode 32, and he added, how do you handle inventory management and encumbrance in your games? Which I think is a great question.
I can't believe we have not really talked about that issue yet in these 50 episodes.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. But I mean, I guess it's on there, just no one rolls ones.
So I don't do math well. If he came on in like the early 30s, was that like way pre-pandemic? Like all time has ceased to have meaning for me.
That's a good question. I think that might have been pre-pandemic or like just into it where we're all still hopeful.
Yeah, we're like, yeah, this will probably last a week and then we'll all be back.
Yeah.
Well, let me start throwing out some ideas here for the table, Chris, and then you can do the same. Here's a topic that has become like more real to me in the last couple of months as it has for you. So maybe I would like to get a topic in there about managing scheduling and I don't know, the logistics of like scheduling games and doing people's availability.
Yeah, that's a really good topic. I think everybody approaches it a little bit differently too.
Yep.
And no one really feels like they do it well.
Yeah. So
that's actually probably another good nuance to this is the better topics are the ones that we're not sure what the answer is immediately as well. So yeah, I think I'm thinking just because I like just ran a game with a bunch of people that didn't have dice, like something about dice.
Why D4s are the worst kind of die?
Yeah, like D4. Yeah. How do you pick up a D4?
Yes.
Like you don't. Do you require dice at the table almost like what do your players use as dice, like something along those lines? Does that make any sense at all?
It does. Yes, I feel like we're circling around a number of couple of interesting ways we could go with the topic of like physical dice at the physical table.
Yeah.
So why don't, just for the sake of getting something out on the chart, we put down something like, how do you use dice at the table or something? Okay. And then that's the sort of thing where I imagine, depending on who we're talking to about it, it could go in like one of about 10 different interesting directions. Okay.
Yeah, I like that. I think, something that's sort of related to that thought that I was having is like something along the lines of like, how do you, and maybe we've talked about this, like how do you introduce newbies to role-playing games?
We have, but I think the two of us have more experience now than we did when that first came out. So, okay. And I don't mind repeating some of the good topics that we had good conversations with, because there'll be conversations with new people.
Yeah, I'm actually going to throw that. Like, I think we should do the doors and dungeons question, right?
Sure.
Because I still have more to say.
Well, here's another specific one that is relevant to you. How do you do mazes?
Oh, yes.
Mazes or labyrinths of any sort. Because when you were prepping your game, I think you were chatting in the Discord a little bit about mazes, and there's like at least 3 different ways you could handle a maze came up.
Yeah, and that's one. I think we all have the inclination of like we really want to run a maze. Like everybody wants to run a maze, but like it's hard to do. So it's a good topic. Dungeons. I already did not write down one of these. Oh, how do you bring newbies?
Yeah. Okay.
I don't love that term, newbies. We've said it a bunch. Is there a different way to say that? Like,
I would just say, I don't know. No, I don't think there is another way to say it.
Okay. I'm going to say new people to the hobby.
Yeah.
The hobby. I also don't like the term the hobby, but that's probably a long rant for another day.
It's better than the industry, but
yes. Yeah.
Okay, well here's something else. I don't know exactly what the question here might be, but do you and how do you handle like luck points or fate points? Like
Ooh,
a lot of games have some kind of mechanic that like give the players some kind of a extra chance or something like that. I don't think we've ever
yeah.
talked about that on the show.
I wonder if like luck or
Or
um
even like
like
plot point type things. Yeah.
yeah, or like supernatural help.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
I've done that. Yeah, I've done that a few times. Not to start talking about the topic, but like yeah, just like
Yeah.
have their gods,
That's right.
step in at some point. Like
Yeah,
that can be
actually, we're
really
going to go on and
interesting.
talk about all these topics.
Yes,
So
yeah.
brace
Just
yourself for
knock
a
them out.
7-hour podcast.
Yeah, one after another. Yeah,
Okay, so
luck or
what number are we up
supernatural.
to?
We're at 7
Oh,
right
great.
now. I don't. I'm not saying that we need to keep everything that we've said,
Right,
but
right,
like
right, right.
we have 7 ideas at this point. So.
Okay. So can you think of something like maybe when you were running your Halloween games that you just that caught you off guard? Like we've talked a little bit about like players derailing, but like your experience of having one of the players immediately like just go off on a completely unexpected
Mhm.
direction. I mean that's a GMing challenge right there.
Yeah, I think maybe the question to add, like maybe the question is like what do you expect of your players in terms of following the direction of the game? Like or
Hmm.
like what kind of buy-in do you expect? Right. So like the thing that I'm thinking about is like no one wants to play with someone who's just going to be an edge lord and just like refuse to do anything,
Yeah.
not be part of the party, that sort of thing. So it's like yeah, like what expectations do you set for for like good teamwork at the
Hmm.
table
Yep.
or engagement with the narrative, maybe like what expectations do you set for the engagement, yeah, for engagement with the narrative.
That's making me think of a meta question. How do you introduce a campaign, or how do you? I hate this word, but how do you like onboard people into a campaign? Not like
Yeah.
new players, but so in prepping my Alien game, for example, I've been weighing like, do I send out lots of like write ups of information about the setting and the scenario in advance? Do I just tackle that in the first session? That sort of thing. Like, how do you have
Yeah.
this new campaign you're going to launch on? Like, how do you manage the launch of a new campaign?
Yes, that is a super good question. That's something with the one shot in particular. I was trying to thread the needle on a little bit because I didn't want people to get too attached to their character concept. So I didn't send them. I very purposely did not send them a lot of information about how we were going to do character creation.
Hmm.
And I know that bugged a couple people a lot because they wanted to be ready, as soon as they showed up with the whole thing filled out. Which kind of fits. I mean, we do have a podcast where we don't let people prepare, so I guess that's that's just who I am.
That's right. So I don't know if there is a good question in this, but I have a great love of thinking about how to replicate other mediums
Hmm.
in role playing. So, like that Final Fantasy question I ask, how do you take some of the like attractive qualities of this genre over here and like bring them into and represent them in role playing? That's a
Hmm.
really broad question.
Looking at the past episodes, we talked about like what elements do you bring from other media
Hmm.
into the games, but I don't think we've talked about like how would you go about like adapting a genre to a
Yeah.
role playing game.
What about something like what house rules have you made to achieve like a certain effect?
Hmm.
That's not quite right, but I also find it interesting the challenge of like I want my players to do more of this sort of thing, or I want the game to have this kind of feel. Is there like a number or a rule I can just adjust that will create the incentives to make that happen?
Yeah. Ooh, there's something there. I don't know how to word that question.
Okay.
Um,
Well, we can leave it a little bit vague right now and just jot it down
okay.
because still in the idea phase. And then
Yeah.
I suppose, after the show here, you and I will kind of polish these up and
Yes.
publish
Yeah,
them,
for
right?
sure. Yeah. Yeah. So we're at 10 ideas here. Although I'm still writing down that last one. So like
Let's get a couple more out there.
okay.
And we're coming up on, probably time before too long here. So, how do you incorporate families into your games? I guess that's not a great way to put it, but are families, do PCs in your games have family lives? And if so, how do you, how is that a factor or not a factor in your games?
Ooh, yeah, that's a good one. That is a good one. I always like thinking about, yeah, thinking about like, yeah, the characters as complete three-dimensional people. Yeah, it's like, if they're gonna just hang out in town for a year in between adventures, they're gonna get entangled with someone. So let's see. I just had something on the tip of my tongue. Oh no, I don't know if we've talked about this, but I would love a conversation of just like, how do you go about naming NPCs and towns?
Yeah, that's a good one. And that's nice and specific. We're drifting away a little ways away from the specificity. So,
because that is something I am not great at. So I want someone to give me the magic there.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's 12. You have anything else that you're just like, oh, I've got it?
I don't think so. I am recalling a discussion not too long ago with a couple of former guests on this show, outside of the show, about how they use like digital games, like PDFs and stuff like that. And I feel like there might be a topic in there, like how do you get the most out of a PDF game.
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's especially, I feel like, more and more relevant lately.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a new topic, but I think it's one we're all suddenly more faced with all the distance gaming. All right, so do you have anything else, or do you want to call it a wrap?
Let me just I'll read through them, I think, and then we might just rule out a couple of these, or we might rule them out because I can't read my handwriting. So the first one was just about like inventory management, right? So this is the one from Don Stroud, like, how do you handle inventory management and encumbrance? Scheduling, how do you handle scheduling? How do you use dice at the table? I think I'm just going to say no on that. I think okay, that one's just
that's a little too vague.
Yeah. How do you bring new people to the hobby? Doors and dungeons, let's add that back in. Mazes in games. How do you handle luck or supernatural help? Do you allow it, I guess, is probably the first question there. What expectations do you set for players for kind of sticking to the narrative? How do you manage onboarding, starting a campaign? What house rules do you have to facilitate the genre you're trying to play in? How do you incorporate families for the PCs? How do you name NPCs and towns? And how do you use PDFs? How do they work?
Yes.
Any of those just like stick out to you as that's just not worth talking about?
I think that's a pretty good list there. I have a feeling if after the show, if we can try and create a polished final version of each of those, it will be more obvious which ones are not going to fly.
Yeah, I think so too. Just like looking at this, I think the how do you bring new people to the hobby there's a lot of overlap with like maybe even house rules or starting onboarding a campaign. So
we'll
see. We'll take some time. That was fun to do on air, and I think saved us from probably like months of agonizing over it. Too. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad we did this too, because for months we have been saying to each other, and I'm sure we've been boring our listeners with it as well, talking about refreshing the table at some point in the future. So it is almost complete, dear listeners. So, well, we can probably wrap up there, and we'll be back with episode 51 to dawn of a new age in podcasting.
Yeah, it is. with season 2 of
season 2. We
got
to start calling it season 2. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, we should probably end on a cliffhanger. Yeah. Which one of us is in peril? Oh
boy. Well,
yeah.
We are in the middle of a pandemic, so, there's a certain, we're both at like just 40% peril, like by default. But I don't know. I don't really feel especially imperiled at the moment, aside from that.
Do you have like any like really good stories of like of a character being in peril that we could use?
Of a character being in peril?
Yeah.
Oh man, do you?
I don't know. I mean, I think like probably the most like epically perilous thing that I've run was the end of my kind of long running campaign where they face down Tiamat directly in the Seven Hells.
It is hard to top that. Speaking of that Final Fantasy feel, you were killing a god, right?
Yes, yeah. How will you kill this guy? Yes. So, dear listeners, you have just been transported to the Seven Hells, staring at the faces of the dragon heads of Tiamat. What do you do? I've been Chris Salzman.
I have been Andy Rao.
And remember, if your players are having fun, you're a great GM.